Thanks, Rob. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about satiety and how we can optimize your diet to manage your hunger. So I'd be remiss of me as an engineer if I didn't first start with a bit of a plan, a bit of a map of where we're going. So there's a number of different systematic aspects of satiety that I'm going to try and cover today in 20 minutes. Good luck. So first up, we've got our physiology. John talked a little bit about that, how we burn and oxidize the different fuels we consume. Going to look at the best laboratory data that we have to look at. Going to look at big data. You're all walking around with one of these and voluntarily recording everything you eat, taking a photo of every meal. Some people, Dave. Going to look at nature. Going to look at how Mother Nature fattens up animals for winter to make sure they can survive until spring. Going to look at hormones, our dopamine effect, and look at how different foods are reinforced by hormones. Going to look at big food and how they use this technology and understanding to sell more food to us. Going to look at the effect of food cost and how that helps us to consume more of the foods that have a very low satiety. Nutrient density, my other pet topic, look at how that correlates with satiety. And then the insulin index to look at how we can manage diabetes but also maximize fat loss by maximizing satiety at the same time. So the first major concept I want to talk to you about is oxidative priority. It's really just the order in which we burn the fuels we consume. So the first one is alcohol. Alcohol is basically jet fuel for our metabolism. The body burns it off really quickly. There's no storage capacity in your body, in your bloodstream for alcohol. And the body just says, okay, out the door, we're going to burn that first. Everything else waits in line. Second, we've got protein. Now, there's definitely a need for protein to build your muscles and repair your organs and fuel your neurotransmitters so you can think well. But there's a limited capacity in your bloodstream. There's only about 500 calories you see there for protein in your bloodstream. So when you've had enough protein, your body just says, put down the fork, no more steaks, thanks. We have to burn off that extra protein to get rid of it. Next, we've got carbohydrate. We've got about 2,000 calories, about a day's worth of fuel in our muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, and in our bloodstream. Once that gets full, as John was talking about, the body upregulates insulin, shuts down fat burning, and says we're going to get rid of our carbohydrate before we get rid of our fat. The body loves fat. Fat's a fantastic fuel. It's our primary fuel potentially, and the body really likes using and storing fat. But we do get to a point, our storage capacity is nearly unlimited, but we do get to a point where we reach our personal fat threshold. We reach the point where our body just gets full, the adipose tissue becomes inflamed, and basically everything just backs back up in the system. So we see elevated carbohydrate, glucose in our bloodstream, and that leads to diabetes and also fatty liver. We see all that extra energy being stored in our heart, our brain, our lungs, and all our vital organs, which is basically effectively the bottom line of our metabolic syndrome that we're facing today that we have to manage. The second key concept is dietary induced thermogenesis, another complex sounding term, thanks for the introduction, John, to all these complex topics, which refers to the amount of fuel that is lost when you burn a particular fuel for energy. So we've got protein. We lose about a quarter of the protein we consume as just in that conversion process. We can convert protein via gluconeogenesis into ATP to be burnt in a mitochondria, but the body really doesn't like to do it that much. We effectively lose 25 calories if we add 100 calories of protein. But the body just goes, that's really hard, dude. Can you just woe back on the protein? Maybe you could eat some carbohydrates. And the body much prefers to use carbohydrate as a fuel. We lose about 8% of the energy from carbohydrate in that conversion. But then last of all, we've got fat. Again, body's primary fuel loves to use fat and burn fat and store fat. So we lose about 3%. This, in my mind, has really helped me understand this phenomenon that we all see called the dessert stomach. So that's where you've had this massive steak meal, you've had steak and veggies, go, wow, I couldn't eat another thing. And someone comes along and says, hey, I've got this cheesecake, you want a piece? I go, yeah, okay, maybe have a piece. And then 5 minutes later, got a second one of that? It was really yummy. So I think what seems to be happening here is that we're fueling both our carbohydrate and our fat metabolism. We're filling both fuel tanks at once without that protein, which is effectively a brake on our satiety. So really the bottom line of all this is that if you want abs, if you want to manage blood sugar, if you want to reduce the insulin level, if you want to avoid the diseases of the metabolic diseases of Western society, we need to find a way to reduce our body fat stores. And to do that, you just need to simply not stack up so much fuel in front of your body fat. But that's unfortunately not very simple. We're all walking around, some of us track calories and some of us try intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding or all these different hacks to try and manage our appetite. But in that quiet moment when you're alone with the fridge at night or, calories don't count when they're eaten in the dark, is that right? In front of the TV or I don't know. But that reptilian part of our brain that is its job is to keep us alive is always stronger, always wins out over the conscious part of our brain that wants to look good and wants to live a long time and all those sort of conscious things. The reptilian instincts always win. So I think the potential holy grail, my favourite movie here, if you pick it up, is to understand what is it about our food that we eat that drives us to consume more, and then how do we reverse engineer that to understand what is it about our food that can enable us to eat less intuitively without having to battle and struggle with our appetite. So the most interesting work done in this area was back in 1995 at the University of Sydney by Susanna Holt and colleagues. What they did, they took 38 different foods. They fed 1,000 kilojoules of each food to a range of different subjects, and they measured their perceived satiety ratings every 15 minutes. After 3 hours, they then gave them an unlimited buffet and said, eat as much as you want. They measured that and developed this Satiety Score. So you see white bread there has a Satiety Score of 100. Plain potatoes cooked and cooled and reheated in the microwave. How many of you recently had a plain potato by itself, no salt, no butter? Raise your hand. Nobody. That was really, really hard to eat a lot of 3 hours later. So you were really full. Maybe it's the resistant starch. Who knows exactly why that was. Then you've got the croissant, the cake, the donut, the chocolate bar, potato chips. It's these combinations of fat plus carbohydrates that they found to be really hyperpalatable. You could eat a lot, you weren't very full, and later on you could eat a ton really easily, so you weren't very satiated. So this is an interesting chart, but a little bit hard to make sense of to understand the parameters that affect our satiety. So being the Excel nerd I am, I dropped it into Excel and had a bit of a play to understand the different parameters of our food that drives satiation versus hunger. So you can see the weight of the food has an effect. Foods like the oranges and the grapes are hard to overeat. They're bulky, they've got a lot of water, they've got a lot of weight compared to the chocolate cake and the donut and the white bread down the bottom left corner. Fibre, again, hard to eat high fibre foods. They again fill you up, they're quite bulky. Again, it's those combination foods down in the bottom corner. Common theme you might pick up through the presentation. Protein, unfortunately, I only had a couple of high protein foods, the steak and the fish. But there definitely seems to be a trend there. But I suppose this sort of data set shows you, drawing a trend line is a little bit tenuous, I'll admit, and it'd be nice to have more data in the middle here. 38 data points is hardly enough to really be really confident about this. A lot of things in nature follow a bit of a U-shaped curve, and if you want to optimize for your energy intake, a little bit of fat, not too much, seems to be that optimal level to maximize your intake. Low-fat foods are hard to overconsume. High-fat foods are a little bit harder to overconsume than those combination foods. Sugar is interesting. The juicy fruits, the grapes, the oranges are hard to overconsume. They're bulky compared to the Mars bars, which is the combination of fat and sugar together. Then starch, you've got that mysterious potato up here again. It's very confusing, but especially in this audience. But and then you've got the combination in the middle, and then those fish and steak, which are low starch, are harder to overconsume again. So Overall, it was really confusing and interesting and intriguing, and I'd been aware of this research for a while, but it was hard to know what to do with that until this paper came along. My nutrient optimizer partner Alex dug this up, and it was 500,000 days of food diary records from 10,000 people logging for more than 2 months. They did a machine learning algorithm scrape of a whole range of MyFitnessPal records, dumped them into a big data file and published them in the Proceedings of the Pacific Symposium on Biocomputing. So massive data set, nobody really crunched it to understand what we could learn, and data mining, as Ken referred to in his presentation. So we took that and developed a satiety score that the bottom line is it correlated quite nicely with the University of Sydney laboratory data. So we can now, based on that, rank foods based on how satiated they'll make you feel, based on how easy they'll be to overconsume. So you've got your potato, you've got your Mars bar, cake, donut down the bottom corner here. So that's not the end, I'll tell you how we got there. So this chart here shows the recorded calories versus the goals. So this axis here is basically whether someone was able to achieve their goals. So when you're tracking, some days you make it, some days you don't. And we've shown here for protein, people who tended to eat a higher percentage of protein tended to consume less calories versus the people who consumed a lower percentage of protein tended to consume more calories. So this is sort of how we've done the analysis of those 500,000 days of MyFitnessPal data records. So I've shown here, just for simplicity, satiety versus hunger on this axis, and just some diagrams of foods that fit into each of those just to understand. So 30 to 40% protein involves eggs and cheese. Similar to the HALT data, you see fibre is satiating, so foods with more fibre tend to be more satiating. This one's quite interesting and intriguing. Foods that are very, very low fat are hard to overconsume. Meanwhile, it's those combination foods again that we see, the baked potato with butter and sour cream, the crackers are easy to overconsume. As we move to the right, we see foods with higher protein tend to be harder to overconsume, but then as you move further and further to the right, as you take out the protein and add refined fat, it just doesn't seem to have that break. The body's going, give me the fuel, I really like that fuel, and it doesn't have the protein to say, okay, enough. This is probably the most intriguing slide of the presentation. Again, you see that combination fat plus carbs. Very high carb, low fat foods over here. Potentially people talk about the Okinawans and the Catawans. They had these mythical blue zone diets where they lived and thrived and lived happily ever after. But unfortunately, that's probably what they're sort of eating over here, but unfortunately since World War II and the widespread use of vegetable oils, they're all sort of drifting back to this zone in here. And you'll hear the Catawans and the Okinawans potentially aren't doing so well anymore since the advent of modern food processing. In this area here, the 20 to 30% carbohydrate seems to be a sweet spot for satiety. Once you move out of that danger zone to this sort of sweet spot area, it seems potentially, I'm still intrigued, but I've cut the data a whole lot of different ways, but higher protein, you're potentially burning your own body fat, so you're getting endogenous ketones, so you'll see your ketones rise, you'll get an improvement in satiety, you'll feel really good and go, this is the bee's knees, I'm going to do this forever. As you move further to the left, potentially getting a higher energy density, you'll be getting what I call exogenous ketosis, where you're actually burning the dietary fat and you're seeing that generate your ketones in your blood. So I'd love to see this refined a little bit more, but as I said, it always comes out this way when we do different types of analysis. So this is the frequency distribution curve of all the people from the MyFitnessPal tracking, and what just blew me away, everybody is optimizing for a carbohydrate intake that maximizes their ability to intake calories. So they're minimizing satiety with their natural choice of carbohydrates. So we all seem to gravitate, there's not many people following that Katavan, Okinawan, legendary blue zone diet. There's probably more people following the sweet spot low carbohydrate diet, probably most people in this room, but it's that poor satiety outcome that seems to happen here when we combine the fat and carbs together. And then not as many people are following a strict, very, very low carb diet over here. That combination fat plus carbs seems to be described really nicely by this recent Cell Metabolism paper. They talk about the super additive dopamine effect of combining fat and carbohydrate on food reward. They found that foods that have fat and carbs together just tend to be more desirable, we'll pay more for them, we get a double dopamine hit. So to explain that, you can imagine your hunter-gatherer in the Arctic in the winter is running around chasing down woolly mammoths, as we all like to talk about, and consumes that, feeds it to his family, gets a fantastic dopamine hit. The body says, great job, do that again, keep doing it, we'll survive through the spring. Meanwhile, you've got the Katavan or the Okinawan or the gatherer in the summer, in the temperate zone. They're probably eating a lot of vegetable matter and carbohydrate type diets. They similarly get a dopamine hit for getting calories, and they consume that, and the body goes, good job, keep doing that. But what we seem to do with modern food is we combine those fat and carbs together, and the body goes, wow, this is amazing. It's summer and winter in the one package. Just keep that coming, thanks. Just keep on coming, and I'll just eat as much as you can give me of this, because it must be autumn, must be winter's coming, and I just need to continue to consume more food. So fat and carbs are rare in nature, but one example is human breast milk. It's basically grow food for babies. Babies love it. They obviously get a dopamine hit for consuming that, and they quickly grow into children. Yeah. I don't know, who didn't know that? Sorry. Anyway, revelationary stuff here. Yeah, so another example, rare example, is acorns, which a squirrel loves, prepares them for winter. Autumn goes on for a particular amount of time, and then they're no more, and they go into, they've been fattened up. But there have been occasions where your little squirrel, unfortunately, autumn goes on for too long. It's too hot for too long, and those acorns are around for too long. And the poor little squirrel gets fat and diabetic and a bit sad, and see the sad squirrel here. Anyway, and I suppose that, I think, is what is effectively happening across our food system. So back from 1910, our carbohydrates have decreased, our fat has increased as a percentage as we've been able to process food. Our food manufacturing has given us what we want, and which tends to be that similar ratio of fat and carbs together. When you look at what's happened as far as changes since 1910, carbohydrate, which is the red line, dropped down to 1960. We improved our food, our agricultural practices to the point that we could make more food, better fertilizer, planting from fence to fence, and just maxing out that. Meanwhile, vegetable oils kicked in about 1920, I think, and just continued to increase our fat intake. Protein, the green line, increased just a little bit, but when you combine the carbs, protein and fat, you get an availability of energy in the diet that nicely matches the obesity epidemic. Not saying correlation is causation, but interesting. Similar things happened in China, where they've just added vegetable oils to their diet, basically doubled their intake of fat. Carbs has dropped as a percentage, and we've got a very interesting situation where their obesity rates have followed a similar trend overall. It's not just China, America, Asia, it's all over the world. Vegetable oil consumption, you look at the axis here in terms of calories per day per person, it's massive. We're just consuming a lot more vegetable oils, and it's mainly the subsidised soy, canola, corn that makes up most of that. So we're just eating a lot of agricultural oils that's bolstering our diet. And when we add that to starch, it makes the chip, it makes the croissant, it makes the hamburger, the donut that we just love and just can't say no to. But we don't just consume macronutrient, one macronutrient at a time, we consume combinations. So I thought, hey, what are the macronutrient combinations that'll drive us to eat less automatically, and which ones help us to eat more? So you can see here protein and fibre. The more of your calories as a percentage that come from protein and fibre together, I think the less you'll be likely to eat, at least based on 500,000 data points from MyFitnessPal users. Meanwhile, if you're trying to restrict calories and a lot of your diet comes from starch and fat, your chances of not just going back to the fridge at midnight and binging on your favourite comfort food is very, very low. So if you look at what the protein and fibre foods look like, they're sort of that bodybuilder cutting sort of diet, so no surprises there. If you look at starch and fat, you've got lasagna, the cookie, the buttered potato with extra sour cream, the donut, and the Ritz cracker, which is the rich, buttery classic. But no, butter was actually harmed in the making of the Ritz cracker. You've got enriched flour, wheat flour, soybean oil, sugar, partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil, trans fats, and high fructose corn syrup. So, and really, if you look at what's changed over the last 50 years, it's those added fats and oils and flours and cereals, which has risen in lockstep with the obesity epidemic overall. So if you're looking for an elephant in the room, it's that combination of flours and cereals and added fats that I think is getting us into trouble. You can see added sugars rose to about 1999, has dropped back since then. Meanwhile, the vegetables, fruit, dairy, meat, eggs and nuts have really not changed. So if you're looking for a culprit for the obesity epidemic, Occam's razor, probably need to look up here to the added fats and flours and cereals. So being the father of 2 growing teenage children, I thought, it'd be interesting. I Googled on the Coles website to find out how I could feed them most cost effectively. So I found canola oil, I can feed them for 50 cents a day, sugar for about $1, flour for a little bit more. You've got the unsubsidized olive oil and coconut oil that's a fair bit more expensive. But as you move down, you just basically increase in vegetables and real whole foods that are going to be satiating and nutrient dense. You can, $15 a day of eggs, $30 to $40 worth of steak, $50 worth of salmon, $100 of blueberries, or $139 of spinach if you want to live on that. So it's, the food manufacturers know that flour and sugar is cheap, it's hyper palatable, and it's what's in all those foods in the center of the aisle that they're making a killing out of. Nutrient-dense foods that are actually satiating and nutritious and good for you is an investment, unfortunately, because these are all subsidised, and anyway, that's how it is. Another way to look at it is in terms of the satiety score versus the nutrient density score. Now, nutrient density is a measure of the amount of nutrients in those foods that are harder to find. So the more nutritious and the more satiating foods are those sort of non-starchy veggies. Probably, there's my spinach for $139 a day up the top right corner, unfortunately. As you move down, you've got the seafood and the meats and dairies and nuts. And down here, guess what? It's those processed grains mixed with oils that are both have a poor nutrient density and a very poor satiety. So it's these cheap, hyperpalatable, nutrient-dense foods that are going to drive you to overconsume them. Not good for anybody other than the food industry. So another way I like to look at this is in terms of satiety versus the insulin load. My wife Monica is a type 1 diabetic, so managing diabetes is really close to my heart. So foods up the top here, like the butter and cream and avocado, etc., will help you stabilize your blood sugars, help you stabilize your insulin requirements. But as you move to the right, these foods will improve satiety and improve fat loss. So I think a lot of people start their diet journey in here, just eating hyperpalatable junk food, processed food. It's cheap, it's yummy, it's hard to stop because we've got a double dopamine hit that says keep doing that. Winter's coming. People move to therapeutic ketosis, like a lot of us probably in the room did. We added butter to our coffee and blood sugar stabilized, satiety improved. Maybe you lost a bit of weight and said this is fantastic. Some people move on to a nutritional ketosis type approach, a little bit less emphasis on the added fat. A lot of people sustain really nicely on that low carb sort of window where you've got not as much fat and just whole foods that aren't full of the processed junk. But excitingly, I think the satiety index, if you want to go for aggressive fat loss and keep on moving on that journey, I hope the satiety score can really help people to continue that journey. So the takeaways, thank you for your time. It's probably not the carbs or the fat, but rather the fat and the carbs together that are the real problem in our diet. Starch and oil is the signature for addictive, hyperpalatable, obesogenic, nutrient-poor junk food. And yeah, Ted Naiman's avoid at all costs is pretty much where it's at. Thanks so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you about this today. The full article is over at Optimizing Nutrition, which is my blog, and we've developed this free Never Hungry Diet app. So the idea here, go to this tiny URL and you can go through your next shopping expedition journey of navigating the right foods to balance cost and nutrient density and weight loss. You can check each food before you put it in your trolley and say, hey, is that, maybe you want to start with a satiety score of 40 as your starting point, and once you master 40, move to 45 and keep moving up. We also show the insulin index and the nutrient density score to help you find your way in a dangerous place called the shops. So thank you very much for your time. Cheers.